Welcome to the Nikos show. Today on the show we have Jeff Buchanan, who has a background in the military, design, graphics, and in the computer game industry. So, Jeff, how are you doing today, sir?
Oh, not bad. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. So, how did you get into this whole computer game industry right at the start, working for the military?
Uh, Back when I was in high school, actually, I went to work for the U.S. government in the Department of Defense at a research testing lab that was in the county where I lived. And I worked for the DoD for about a little over 8 years. And then I went into the military, which was kind of a family history thing. A lot of, from my grandfather forward, there'd been a lot of people in my family that served in the Marines. So I served a little over six years in the Marine Corps. Got wounded during Desert Storm and ended up getting out. Uh, my wife at the time, I'd met her while I was in Japan working in the Marines, and she wanted to go back to Japan for a bit. So I started looking around for a job there, and ended up getting a job at Sega in Tokyo.
So, What was your day to day like when you were at Sega?
Really interesting. When I first went in and interviewed, I had this happy, nice man that was showing me around. Had a translator between us. He spoke, pretty decent English, but he found it easier to be able to explain everything quickly in Japanese. And of course, I got it translated across. And uh, come to find out, the guy I interviewed with, which I had no idea about at the time, but that was Yu Suzuki, the head of AM2 at Sega. And I got brought into the AM2 team. So day to day, when I initially started, they said, "Oh, we're building a fighting game. It's going to be the first 3D fighting game." So we like the fact that you've had an art background, but you've also studied martial arts and being in the military. You've got a background that suits working with our animators to develop really good fighting motions for the game. So that was my introduction to the game world, stepping in a role to
What computer game was that?
virtual fighter.
I thought it was that, yeah, because that's the first 3D game that I remember with being in the
Yep.
arcades. Um, it was a clean game. It was why you always sometimes you wonder like why do they keep making new fighting games because it's quite basic punch kick jump dodge, what new is there.
Yeah. Yeah, so Virtual Fighter had a very interesting idea that they wanted to really build solid fighting styles for each one of the characters in the game, and we went to a lot of efforts at reviewing certain styles, and then eventually we ended up even bringing in to help try to speed the process for building the animations out. We brought in some um, motion capture systems, and the first time they were used in video games. And the first system we got was a system, I guess, that came out of Italy, and it just didn't meet our needs. It wasn't quite capable of capturing uh, the range of motions that we needed between two characters in a fight scenario. And then we ended up going with another system that was developed, I think, out of Delft University in Holland, and where a young man came over that worked with us on that, and that one proved to be the one that for I'm sure the first two fighting virtual fighter games we used that system, and of course, a lot of it was still hand animation work. And once we had the data, we back then we had to do a lot of cleanup work with the data and all to get it to work with our characters properly.
So were you quite hands on with the hand to hand animation?
Yeah, that was a very funny thing. Back when I was a kid, I always found animated movies to be really interesting, and I always wanted to work on an animated movie. But just never had really the formal training or anything for it. So when I first got there, I was introduced to the 3D package Softimage, and they were using that to build the animations on the characters. So I think my first 2 weeks there at Sega was kind of a crash course on working with Softimage to animate human characters, and I was pretty happy there at the end of the first 2 weeks. I'd made a certain attack motion for one of the characters, and they looked at it and they're like, "Yeah, this is good enough. We can put it in a game." So that was kind of the start for me on working down that line of animation.
What character was it?
Um,
Oh, you have to remember.
yeah, I really do have to think about it. But it may have been the character. Strangely enough, that Yusun eventually, when we started trying to name the characters, he gave that character my first name, Jeffrey. So it's the Jeffrey McWild character.
So are you basically animating frame by frame, or do you have like a sort of keyframes and you're drawing the curve or the Bezier
Um,
curves?
yeah, we used keyframes at the time. Obviously, we used Softimage had some different, evolving functions in it that we managed to work with and manipulate. And eventually, like I said, once we brought in the motion capture systems and we got the data, once we recorded the data, we put it through a cleanup process, and then the animators would get it, and we start to then massage the data to try to fit it in with the characters and make everything look smooth. And especially since many of our animations, outside of punches and kicks, we had to really coordinate between two characters in a fight. So there was a lot of hand animation that went into all of that.
Yeah. 2 seconds. I'm just going to move the car because I parked really, really badly because this McDonald's has really beautifully parked now. Right, there we go. Or that's just a really, really good green screen effect.
Yeah. Oh, it looks so real behind you. Look at those people.
Yeah, yeah, and I can interact with them. Look, hello. They wave at me and everything.
Yeah.
By the way, with this whole Chat GBT 4 and all that stuff, that's going to be possible to do that kind of crazy stuff. Generating videos real time.
Yep.
So yeah, I see you also. Can you talk a little bit about what you were doing as a graphics animator for the Navy Surface Warfare Center?
Yeah, when I worked there, actually, there was no animation work within what I did for them. At the time, what we did was we supported programs for research and development for U.S. Navy Marine Corps systems and equipment. Strangely enough, while I was there, I worked on everything from the initial programs that were behind everything for like the new 5-inch gun system that went on the naval ships, um, the Standard 2 missiles, the below deck launch missiles. Um, I drew images of the Aegis class ships before those ships were ever even built. Um, and such things as like the Phalanx weapon system and even the initial Tomahawk cruise missiles. Um, yeah, it was really weird. I had a friend that worked on the Final Fantasy movie there in Hawaii, the one that had the first CG realistic humans. And I went out there for the premiere of the movie, and we went out to Pearl Harbor while I was there, and I was standing there on the deck, just down. We'd been on the Arizona Memorial, then we went over to the USS Missouri, the battleship where World War II ended. We're standing there on the deck. I've got my hand on a gigantic metal Connex box that they launched the cruise missiles out of. I said, "Yeah, here's a funny story." I said, "In World War II, my great uncle was on Okinawa and saw this battleship shelling Shuri Castle and the Japanese forces." I said, "Then I worked on this system that I've got my hand on this box." I said, "I worked on the drawings, initial drawings for this containment box. I worked on the initial drawings for the missile systems." I said, "And then during the Gulf War," I said, "when the United States kicked off the attack against Iraq, I said, I saw this battleship firing those cruise missiles out of these boxes that I had drawn back years before against the forces in Iraq." And I said, "Now I stand here on this ship and I look across Pearl Harbor and there's a line of Aegis class ships sitting there. And I drew those ships before they were actually designed and built." I felt like I was in a
So
time warp.
so how do you design? How do you draw something that's? I would have thought they'd give you the engineering diagrams and then you would take them and make it into a sort of realistic graphic situation, or did they take your pictures and implement them as the engineering
Yeah,
artifacts?
well, it was a thing where the Navy engineers and all would do up the initial designs and stuff for these ships, and then what we did at the graphics department was we were providing materials to where they went and pitched the ideas to the Pentagon to try to get the programs going and built into real equipment. So we would take their engineering drawings and then pretty them up and finalize them into what would look like final working equipment.
Right. Okay. Great. So your designs for the Phalanx got actually implemented.
Yeah, yeah, the Phalanx weapon system. Yeah, I even at one point I drew the logo for the working team down there, which was a real fun thing. But yeah, that was that system. I got to see some of the early tests and stuff. Back in the day when we did it all. Like when I was in high school and college and years after. I couldn't even talk with my friends or family about what I was doing because everything was classified at the time. But over the years, all these systems have now come out, and everybody's seen a million photographs of them, and I get to sit there and smile and go, "Yeah, I worked on all that."
So how does that start? Does your boss come to you and says to you, "I want you to draw me a really big gun that can shoot missiles out the sky or something," and you just
No, we would like I said, we would get some of the engineering material and stuff and the concepts and of course they sometimes even had built prototypes before we even got the stuff to finalize the presentations. But yeah, occasionally we were asked to make up stuff. Yeah, it was another weird thing. I know there'd been prototypes by the different companies that were going for the contracts, but they were trying to show how the Humvee would be used to replace like the Jeep and medium sized vehicles and all for the Army, Marine Corps, different units. So I drew out a Humvee early on, and then I went in changing out the back end of it. We were replacing anti-aircraft guns and mortar systems and heavy machine guns and all kinds of made up mounts into the back of it to show, hey, this vehicle is versatile. You can use it for all kinds of different things. So yeah, like I said, that was a very interesting thing for me to get into, especially starting off as a high school student, working down there as a student trainee, and then when I finished up my high school in '79, they said, "Hey, we'd like for you to take on a full time job here at the base. So go off and get your degree at college." So I got my degree, commercial arts, specializing in illustration. And once I finished that up, my title down there at the base had changed from something like graphic designer to illustrator.
so was it Humvee designed before you started drawing with it?
Yeah, like I said, the a number of different companies had made design ideas, and they gave them to the government, trying to get the contracts to develop the vehicles. So when it came to us, one of the things the Navy was asking us to do was, hey, can you show how this design could be made? You know, to the so the whole payload area in the back could be designed in different configurations to do different missions. So what we did was, like I said, we attached all kinds of different gun systems, body covers, everything else to the back end of them to say, hey, you can use it as an ambulance, you can use it as a communication vehicle, you can use it for anti-aircraft, you could use it for, a gun truck, whatever, suppression system they wanted to put on it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think your job still exists in that format today?
To be honest, I've heard a lot. I mean, it's been a long time since I was attached down there, but no, I've heard over the years a lot more of these type of assignments have been given out to contractors to the U.S. government. So a lot of the work moved from in-house under, specifically, I was a GS worker for the government in the Department of Defense, but nowadays there's I guess probably staffs that are between the engineers on base, and then they actually do contracts to outside groups that do a lot of this type of work. And of course nowadays the way so much of what we did back then was hand drawing and hand painted gouache pictures, and then we photograph these things onto clear cell slides or projector images that they would use in the presentations at the Pentagon. Of course, now everything's done on a computer. I'm sure most of the art's probably created, directly in digital packages, like everything from Photoshop on Corel Paint,
Do you
whatever.
have any of
So,
that art to hand that you could show us on camera?
no, I don't have any on hand. And of course, like I said, most of what I did back then was classified anyway, and I didn't really get to keep anything of what I had. I've got somewhere some images that were, they were kind of placed in the base paper later on when the programs were announced. And so they were made public at the time, and I got to keep a few images of that. But yeah, I'd have to dig down through a box to find where that was at now.
No worries. Okay, cool. So, after that 8 year stint at the Naval Surface Warfare Center, you went into the Marines, 2 years in Japan, and then you got the Purple Heart after in Iraq, I believe, on a
Yep,
mine.
yep. Yeah, I a whole lot of family members had been in World War II, Korea, Vietnam. One of my uncles, he'd served multiple tours during Vietnam, and I think he was the only family member that did the full like 30 years in the Marine Corps. Um, so I don't know, I was turning around 25 or so, working down there at the base. I decided that, hey, I want to get out and see the world. I teased my parents. I said, yeah, you made the mistake of giving me a subscription to National Geographic years ago. And I saw all these wonderful places around the world that I'd really like to see. And being a kind of a small town country boy, I didn't quite know how I'd get out and see the world. So I was like, I'll just go join the Marine Corps now. I'll get out and see the world. So, when I went to my recruiter, I told him, I said, yeah, I said, I want to do this type of duty, which basically I was wanted to go for Marine Corps Embassy security guard because I knew I'd get stationed for 2 year segments at embassies around the world, and you get to live right there where you had constant daily almost exposure to different cultures and different people. Um, I said, yeah, I want to do this duty, and and he's like, oh, but you got to prove yourself to get into that, and I was like, yeah, that's no problem. I said, so I understand that the 0311, which was the Marine Corps Infantry, is the MOS they most choose the embassy guards for, the combat troops. And he goes, well, yeah. He said, but you've got great scores here. He said, I can put you in anything. I can get you into avionics, electronics, blah blah blah. And I said, nah. So sign me up 0311. He's like, you're kidding me. I said, no, I want to do embassy duty. I know that's the MOS they take the most for that school. So sign me up. So I said, oh, by the way, I want to serve overseas my first 2 years until I get into embassy school. And he goes, oh, I can't do that. And I said, oh, I know you can if you want to. He goes, wait a minute. How do you know all this? I said, because my uncle was a recruiter. He said, I should have known. So, yeah, that's what got me over to Japan my first 2 years. And I served at a Suzuki Naval Air Station on the security forces there. They had a Marine Guard back in that day. Uh, and that's another thing over time has changed around. Last time I was in Japan, I went there and looked around, and of course they use naval security on the gates now. Of course, the base is a dual base between U.S. and Japanese forces, and it was in my time as well.
So we could talk about military stuff for the next 10 hours, but let's go back to the gaming side of things. Can you let us know what other games you worked with at Sega?
Let's see. While I was at Sega, I initially was hired to work on the first Virtual Fighter game. I worked on Virtual Fighter, the Virtual Cop series. The initial Virtual Cop.
That was fun. I remember playing that with the guns.
Yeah, even though I wasn't on the initial team for that because of my work with Virtual Fighter. I was still helping them out. Um, because I was the only guy probably on the entire team that ever actually fired a gun. And one of their main designers, he and I would sit down and have long talks about shooting scenarios and all. And we'd all admired, like, there'd been some game from Konami that was a shooter game. It was really, the scenarios were pretty well laid out and were pretty fun to shoot. So, I would talk about things we did in the Marine Corps, like in a shooting house and all scenarios we'd set up and all. And so we went through and set all that up. And then they asked me to work on the second Virtual Cop game directly on the team. And it was funny. We had this very long meeting one day, and they got to the end of the meeting, and wasn't a whole lot directly decided at that time. And over the weekend, I went home and I storyboarded kind of like a scenario for the cops responding to a robbery, and then they got onto a thing of chasing a gang across town, and there were rolling shootouts between cars. There was shootouts on a moving train. Um, and I told you Suzuki, I said, since at the time the games we were making, they went into arcade cabinets, I said, what we need, because we were looking at the demographics for on the first game, I said, we had a limited number of probably uh, female players at the arcades on the first game. I said, if we want to attract more female players in the arcades, and if you went to the arcades in Japan at the time, there were a lot of women, and young women going into the arcades, but not so many of them had picked up and played our game. And I said, well, let's stick a female cop on the cabinet with our other two guys and entice the girls that, hey, it's okay for you to pick up the gun and shoot it too. And so we did that. And when we did our trials, yeah, we had a large number of women started playing the game after that. So we included, you know, just kind of a, hey, it's fine for you to jump in and play this game too. You'll enjoy it. And of course, sometimes, I'm sure a lot of date nights evolved into fellows finding that their dates shot better than they did on the game.
A lot of male ego was put to shame there, probably.
Yep. I remember a story my mother told me. My father was a game warden. Of course, he had to carry a service weapon all the time. And he took my mother out one time to shoot. Of course, she grew up on a farm. And when they went out to shoot, my mother said that she outshot him on targets downrange.
Where did she get her shooting skills from?
Oh, she grew up, like I said, on a farm here in Virginia.
Yeah.
And her, I think she had two sisters and a brother. And somewhere between her brother and my grandfather, they would, take the sisters out shooting out on the farm. So I don't quite know how she got so good with the pistol, because I know Granddad mostly always carried around either a rifle or a shotgun. He had a very large chicken farm, and between the possums, coons, and foxes, they like to raid the chicken coops. So he usually kept a weapon around to, chase off, varmints trying to eat his chickens and their eggs. But Mom got to be a really good shot, and like I said, she went shooting with my dad. He had his service revolver at the time, and she outshot him. So,
Did you make any clothes from those vermin? Like,
nah,
no.
I know my dad for a while when he was younger. He used to trap and sell the pelts, high school, and when he was a young man starting to work there in the area. But yeah, no, we didn't go that far.
There's a lot involved in getting a pelt off a fox, just to skin it, and there's different ways you can skin it, and then just the processing of it. It's fascinating and a great survival
Yeah,
trick to
yeah.
know.
Well, strangely enough, in my family tree, of course, my last name Buchanan is Scottish, by ancestry. But my mother's side of the family is heavily German. My father's side of the family is a long line of Irish, English, and Scottish ancestors. Of course, last name Buchanan is Scottish. But what we found was some of my relatives started looking into our family histories, and we always had known there in Virginia that we had Native American blood as well. But we came to find out that we had both Cherokee and the local tribe, Patawomack tribe, in our ancestral line. Patawomack may come in, people may eventually notice it because there was a famous Disney princess, Pocahontas, that they made a movie about. And of course, she was one of the few Disney princesses that was from a real story about a real person. And Pocahontas had grown up here in the Patawomack tribe, and you know, her father was brother to one of down my ancestral trees, one of my grandfathers. And so that made Pocahontas one of my cousins way back on the family tree line.
They're so well connected, man. With Scottish ancestry, Pocahontas ancestry.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's true. Most Americans are real mutts. And the funny thing was, when I was first over in Japan, my mother-in-law had asked me about, why I was so interested in Japanese culture and history and all. And I said, I don't know. I just find it really fascinating. And my mother-in-law used to joke, it's like, well, you must be a reincarnated samurai or something. And we all found that kind of funny. Well, lo and behold, I did a genetic test a while back, and then they said in my deep, deep ancestry, going back far back in my DNA, that they found that I had Japanese ancestry in my blood.
Really?
And that was like a real shock to everybody. And the only thing I could think is somewhere back in around the Bronze Age, the Jomon period, probably as the people moved from Asia into Japan and eventually moved on up through Japan across the Bering Straits and all into America. And of course, those people, mixed in and became what became known as the Native American tribes as they spread out across North America and then down into South America. Yeah, somewhere along the line in my ancestry, it goes all the way back to some of the early settlers in Japan.
Do you know what part of your genes were Japanese?
I do not know. It's just what I got my feedback from sending in my test was the fact that some of my early, way back when DNA was from Japan. So, Yeah, another odd story on that too was once my wife and I were traveling in Hokkaido, the big northern island, and I saw this massive dig out in the field. And of course, I'd always been interested in archaeology here in Virginia. So I looked at it and I told her, I said, "Oh, that's some huge archaeological dig." And she's like, "Really? That large?" And I said, "Yeah, they must be digging up a village or something." So we stopped and we asked if we could see the dig or any artifacts. And a professor came out and he found it interesting that I was like so interested in it. And I told him, I said, "Yeah, when I saw this, I figured it must be a Jomon period dig." And he's like, "You're right. How did you know that?" I said, "I don't know. I just took a guess." And of course, later on, after finding out about the genealogical thing, I was just like, "Well, isn't that strange?" I said, "Now I come to find out that somewhere back in my family history, around that time period, there was that place. And when I saw it, I was like, hey, isn't this a great place to look at?" Come to find out, yes, I was absolutely right in my thought that it was a Jomon period dig.
Going back to Japanese genetics, wouldn't it be kind of funny if like your genetics would like pass on a very atomic part of your body that's characteristic? So, if say you had like Japanese eyes, and the rest of you was like this, but thankfully, and that mutting.
Yeah. Well, it was a joke I made a long time ago to somebody. It's like, I said, my Native American side means that if I drink a single beer with nothing on my stomach, that it'll get to me in no time. I said, the Scottish side of me means that if I put food and stomach in my belly first,
We're just starting the recording again. Zencaster, please fix your bug. You probably got, I guess, quite emotional when you're working with programmers in high stress environments. So programmers.
yeah, it used to be funny. I remember a friend of mine used to crack up. We'd be in there testing out some of the newest loads, like on Virtual Fighter, and just things would glitch and not work right, and I'd smack the side of the machine, and I'd just jokingly shout out, "Somebody send me a programmer to kill!" And of course, then I found out after the fact that the Japanese didn't quite get the humor of that, and it was just like, "Jonan Dejo, hey, it's just a joke, guys."
You seen that early video where you have this large guy, obese guy, and he's sitting and he's typing, and then he first of all he hits the keyboard slightly hard, and there's a guy in the cubicle. What's that? Then he takes his fist, he starts bashing the keyboard, takes it and whacks him one. You know that one?
Yeah, I've seen it.
It's one of the greatest videos of all time. Man. Cool. So, what
Yeah.
was your time at Activision like then? What did you do for them?
When I went to Activision, it was after my close to 3 years at Sega in Japan. Um, I got hired on at the time because they were starting to move into working on 3D games. Um, and of course, PlayStation at the time, the first PlayStation was becoming the big solid thing. I remember Suzuki, we were working on trying to get Virtual Fighter over onto the Sega Saturn at the time. And when the PlayStation came out, we bought a copy, and Suzuki looked at it and goes, "Man, this is working so smooth. I wish we were putting games on this thing." But we were working on a Pitfall game in 3D at the time. And then many other projects were starting to come along at the time in the company, and some of us were kind of bouncing around and looking at what they were doing and making suggestions. Oh, we should you should probably pick up on this animation package or this 3D software. Um, I guess the dominant one at the time, and of course it was the high end expensive one, was Soft Image. But Wavefront, Lightwave, all those were all floating around at the time. I think that was still before Maya really came out, and of course, some of the other ones started merging together. But it was an interesting time, and especially because our group, the programmers for the project, and all they were still learning how to deal with the PlayStation, and then on the art side, we were trying to figure out, okay, if we want big environments and if we want fully animated characters in 3D, um, you know, how can we build the models, get the amount of textures we need in there, push in all the animation, push in all the sound effects, and get it all to work together, and memory scales and all that. We were told, okay, you can't exceed this. So, we were trying to figure out, okay, how do we get the best looking character, but we're only allowed maybe, 350, 400 polygons to build an entire character with. So that was some of our struggles of the day. And I remember at one point, I guess somebody in the company was going, "Oh well, maybe these people need some help. So let's hire this Hollywood guy to come help them." And they were going to give this guy just a crazy amount of money to come in, and he was only going to come in 3 days a week and supposedly work from home the rest of the time. And the first day he came in, and we were kind of showing him what we had for the project so far, what we were doing. I was explaining it all to him, and I was like, "Yeah, we're kind of constrained right now to 350, 400 polygons the most for characters, for a scene because we end up getting so many things mixed in." And he suddenly kind of was like, what's a polygon?" And I literally just went,
Yay!
yeah, I went back to the director after that, and I was like, "Look, this guy is in no way any value added to the project. As a matter of fact, we're just wasting a huge amount of money, and you're just slowing down the progress of the team. If you hire him, I'm going to quit." so, so they pulled the plug on that idea. Uh, but yeah, it was back in those days. Even the things that AM2 with the model, the early model boards that we got through some of the U.S. defense contractors, the struggles that we had with. All right, we've got just two characters on screen, and we need about X amount of polygons to make them, and the animation data is going to take up a huge amount of memory. So we need to keep our background screens down to a minimum. And of course, after the first Virtual Fighter, which was both basically just polygons with colors, then Virtual Fighter 2, we started expanding into the new thing, which was polygons with textures mapped onto them. But at Activision, yeah, with trying to get everything up and playing on the PlayStation, we were going through some of the same struggles that the design and the art side were being impacted by how much the programming side could find to push, to get the game onto the system. But yeah, it was interesting times, and of course, other projects were coming up around us, and of course, they were all okay. Well, what were you guys' experiences with this, and how can we try to find ways to leverage our memory usage and killer buffer functions, all this other stuff along the way. So fun things.
You sound like a developer, man. Do you have development experience?
Well, I mean, I just learned, like I said, from the time I first got in there at Sega, uh, you know, as you go through first prototyping and trying to build out, a game, and then so often, like I said, the ramifications for what happens on the programming side and what the specifications are for the systems that you're trying to put it onto, whether it be the PlayStation, the arcade system, Game Boy Advance, up to the modern day with the Switch and the rest. I mean, there's always restrictions that sometimes come in there to what your hopes, design ideas are, and then for the art group, it's the implementation of how good can we get it, to work on this system, and you know you might have big dreams for something. Oh, we're going to have an open world, and your character is going to run away from 3,000 zombies, and hey, there's going to be a limit to how much you can run and show on screen at any given time. So obviously nowadays, those limits are getting higher and higher, and the ability to show more, make it more realistic. I mean, it's even fascinating now just to see when you look at a mobile game, and how much they can do on a mobile game now as compared to when we were trying to get some of the first stuff on, say, like Saturn and PlayStation. Um, and of course, even at the time, even our earlier arcade games were extremely limited. Yet we were using some of the most advanced software at the time that came from like Lockheed Martin, from the defense contractors here in the United States. I'd even worked on at Sega a game where their group had come over and we helped them work on a game. They ended up calling it Desert Tank because I guess it came from the idea that they were trying to make tank simulators, for the U.S. Army and all, and Marine Corps maybe to train on. But they were like, hey, we could make a fun, tank fighting game out of this. And of course, they sent their guys over and we helped them with the design. And of course, they were tickled when they got in there. And I was like, yeah, I was a Marine. I was in infantry, but during Desert Storm, we cross trained with tanks. So, I've been up inside of an M60. I know how to gun it. I know how to drive it. I know how to load it. And they're like, "Oh man, that's so cool. Let's put more of this in the game." I'm like, "Nah, you don't want that in the game. It'll be too boring. Let the tanks
Yeah.
just function. Let the player just kind of direct it, drive it, and fire it, and don't worry about the
Yeah.
minutia of all the rest of it.
Have you seen the World of Tanks realistic version? Basically, you got this guy staring at these two large handles, and then just a small hole out there, and he's like shouting to the gunner and the commander. Yeah, you don't
Oh
want
yeah,
realistic.
yeah. I mean, even with modern day tanks, I mean they've got some just amazing equipment in them now. Um, and the ability of those tanks to do so much more today, and for the crews to be aware of so much around them today, is just so much further ahead than what it was, say, even back at my time, Desert Storm, 32 years ago now. But then again, you see that the Russians now, like in Ukraine, are throwing in their old tanks from so far
Yeah,
back, and even trying to upgrade them now, it's just like, wow, those things are going to be so limited on the battlefield.
yeah. I think a lot of World of Tanks geeks will be like so happy to see some real life of this game that they play. The Russians are dumb enough to stick T-42s in front of javelins and stuff like that. You know.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
No, that's the only thing they're doing is just making the Ukrainians burn through more ammunition. They're not giving themselves any advantages by having those older tanks out there on the battlefield.
Yeah, man. Cool. So what did you do after Activision?
Um, let's see. From Activision, I moved on. I worked with Universal at the time. They had a games group. Well, they had their main games group set up right there at Universal there, and outside of Hollywood in the mountains there, where Universal Studios is at. But they at the time they had a branch set up there in the Silicon Valley area, up in San Jose. So I went to work with them. We were working on a Xena Warrior Princess game that they were going to put out on PlayStation. And at the time, of course, that was a huge television show over here. It kind of came from this, you know, kind of back idea, and it took off. I guess Lucy Lawless was the main star in that thing, and of course, we sat down, wrote out a scenario for a story. I got hired on as a senior animator to the group. Ended up during the production of the whole thing, I ended up working also helping the designers out because of background experience of like building out other scenario stuff. When I was at Activision and at Sega, so yeah, I spent a lot of my time both doing in-game and cinematic animations on that project, and then we made some proposals for some other projects, but sadly, Universal at that time decided to close that upper studio, so we put that one game out at the time, and I remember it was a big thing because strangely enough, we were coming up on a E3 show, and for some reason, Sony decided they didn't want to publish the game. EA came in, looked at what we had, and said, "Oh, this is great. Yeah, we'll publish it for you." And they set us up with a whole booth there at the E3 show. The Lucy Lawless lookalike character that was in the stage show at the time over at Universal Studios came in costume and was at our booth. And yeah, we all had so much fun with that entire thing. So it was a cool time. But
Yeah, yeah. I
yeah,
had Kevin Sorbo. I
sadly, it was
had
kind of a one game hit with them, and then off we went, to different studios. Some of those guys ended up over working on. They ended up working on like the what was that game project? The one with Lara Croft,
Tomb Raider.
Tomb Raider. Thank you. Some reason
Yeah.
I had Raider in my head, but it was going cycling around that. But anyway, yeah, some of those guys ended up working on future Tomb Raider games and all, and they had a ball on that. So yeah, it was a good crew we had there from that time, though. A lot of fun. And then
Yeah,
from there, if
Kevin
you want me
Sorbo
to
and
kind
Lucy Lawless are not the best friends anymore right now, unfortunately.
of, yeah, from there, I rolled on to working with Konami up there in the Bay Area, and I was hired on. Strangely enough, I made the jump at that point from being directly in the art design kind of hands-on type of thing to being producer of the project, even though I also uh, ended up taking on a role like creative director at the studio. But I got hired by Konami at the time, and they'd taken on trying to expand out the Frogger franchise. And part of my interview process, I was asked by the VP of the studio, it was like, well, we have the Frogger franchise. What would you do with it? And I was like, well, put out some Game Boy Advance games, but change up, the whole thing, kind of make it a modern kind of tale scenario, and push it that way. So they liked the idea, and off we went. So we made a PlayStation game out of it, and we put out a couple of Game Boy Advance games. And during the process, I think a Hawaiian studio opened up, and uh, they were trying to consolidate. And after they moved, they closed down and moved the studio from there off to the rest of the group in Hawaii. I think they put out at least one more Game Boy Advance game there. Um, but that was a fun time. While I was there, I got to interface with the guys that were working on Silent Hill, um, specifically the second game. So the main guy that had been doing a lot of their CG, especially the interactive cinematic story parts. I got to work with him some. We had a meeting over in Japan. I got to sit down with Kojima and all during the session. We took a break, and while they were on break, I took a bunch of my Marine Corps photographs from different places in the Gulf War and all, spread them out all over the table. When they came back in, Kojima saw that. He freaked out. He's like, "Oh,
Who's
these are awesome.
Kojima?
What are they?" Kojima did the Metal Gear series and has
Right.
gone on since, working on lots of fun different games. But anyway,
Death
yeah,
Rising.
no, not Dead Rising as much. What was the last one they called it? Yeah, it was Dead something, wasn't it?
Dead Rising. Death
Dead
Stranding.
Rising, Death Sound. That's it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so at the time, he loved, because of the whole Metal Gear thing. He loved all this stuff about modern military stuff, and they ended up switching out the group that was supposed to be on the ship guarding that Metal Gear. They ended up making that group U.S. Marines after I presented him with all that material there to work from. So that was a fun thing. And yeah,
So you
Konami was
modified the Metal Gear Solid storyline.
only to the extent that they were still working on it, still trying to develop what things were going to be. And because I made that that little thing, I threw all my pictures out. He was like, "Oh, can I get a copy of these pictures?" And I said, "Oh, I just brought these over. I knew you like military stuff, so yeah, they're all yours." And he freaked out, and he's like, "Yeah, man, I'm going to put the Marines on the ship."
This is for Metal Gear Solid 2.
Yeah, Metal Gear Solid 2, where
Yeah.
they'll
The only one I played was the first one in the
yeah,
extension. I mean, the first time I played Metal Gear Solid 1, I just couldn't believe what I was playing. It was incredible, just
yep.
running up behind people and choking them out, and the graphics were just crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and they only got better. The funny thing at the time was, I was hoping that we could get a boost into what we were doing on the PlayStation by getting some technical support and all from Kojima's team, and he was all up for it. But Konami had this weird thing that every one of their production teams was kind of in competition with each other, so there wasn't really that sharing of knowledge between teams. And that,
Right.
for my group at the time in Silicon Valley, which everything was like, it was so tough back then, even to get programmers into projects, because everybody was throwing big money out for programmers, and we were competing with all of the Silicon Valley startups and all the rest there. Um, and we were really, really handicapped trying to, and that was at the time, I guess, with PlayStation 2, and of course, there were a lot of technical advances at that point, and I'd hired on a couple of guys from the Xena project to work with their stuff, but I don't know. They struggled with the changes that were there between PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 1, and I'd hoped to back up our abilities with pulling in some of the knowledge of Kojima's group, but yeah, Konami didn't really allow it, so that kind of handicapped us at the time.
So you still friends with Kojima?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, friends to that thing that we see each other at a game thing, and we stop and
Yeah,
chat a
yeah.
few pleasantries. It's not like I hang out and drink mai tais with the guy, but yeah, he's a big movie buff, and so am I. So it's one of those things that people that you meet over time in the industries, you always, when you see each other, stop and, hey, how's it been going? How's your family? What's your current project? You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
like in his case, we might say something about movies, or like you, Suzuki. When I was working there at Sega in Japan, we used to, some of the group from Sega, we'd go out and go skiing together out in Nagano or wherever. And so it was like the last time I got to see Yusum, which wasn't very long ago. We were chatting about that, and he was just like, yeah, we're starting to get too old for all that now. And I said, yeah, I know what you mean, but it's still fun.
It's an amazing career you've got, man. It's just like it's a pick and mix of amazing companies from like age. I must have left school and went straight into work, and just the longest CV I've ever seen, I think.
Yeah,
and
it's weird because even my time in the military, back there on the wall behind us, I got some of my ribbons, medals up there, and I was only in for what 6 years and 3 months during that time. Yet, I walked off with a lot more awards usually than people do during that time. But it was because, strangely, I had good advice from my family members, and then I took that advice. I applied it while I was in, and of course, I did the same thing when my son was in. I got his picture over the side with some of his awards. But it was one of those things to where the right opportunities I volunteered to jump into, and that always kind of served me well and put me in interesting places doing fun or interesting things. And when I was in the game industry, I kind of got lucky early on. First with getting into Sega when AM2 was the group to be in, and more by chance than anything, I fell into that, and that kind of set a path for me. And yeah, I followed
what's
through.
AM2?
AM2 was Yu Suzuki's department there at Sega in Japan. So at the time, we were the group that had the most advanced technology. He had pushed for getting their games from 2D into 3D. Had done a whole bunch of different games that pushed the boundaries of what went on in the arcades. They had that whole motorcycle racer that was actually on a body that what happened on screen, you were actually tilting the actual motorcycle you were setting on at the
Oh, I
arcade.
love that game. Brilliant game.
Yep.
That game. Expensive though. I could. Nobody
Oh
was good at
yeah,
it.
they were expensive cabinets at the time, but the arcade groups that could afford to get them and all, they made a pile of money with them. And of course, the Virtual Fighter series, the Virtual Cop series, all of those games, really brought the money in. Yeah, it was a funny thing because about the time, uh, you know, as we were working on Virtual Fighter 2, that was when, all the home arcade systems were really starting to take off with, Saturn being a early adopter, but it just didn't keep up. But, the PlayStation and followed shortly down the road by Xbox. And of course, Sony tried one more time, to get their own system out there, but we were we were working to get what at the time was thought we were going to make it a virtual fighter kind of adventure type game, and later on that became Shenmue, uh, and it kind of took its own separate track in the storyline. But yeah, I'd gotten to work early on that one, kind of proposing kind of a scenario for story, and then working with character stuff on that one. So did character development and some early motion capture work and all for that one as well. So
It's a shame. It's a shame how Sega really suffered after falling behind, rejecting the CD technology to deal with Sony, getting this competition between America and Japan Sega, and they really messed up things for themselves. They should have
yeah,
led.
yeah, yeah. It's a lot of missteps there that led to problems for them down the road. It's still hard for me to think nowadays that it's hard to think that Yu Suzuki is not still part of Sega. I mean, he's been doing some stuff and working with them as a publisher, but he's not directly an employee there. He's got his own little company up there in Tokyo now, and I think the last thing I heard was he had a very large number of projects in the works, and of course he's been working on a lot of things coming out on mobile devices. And the last game they put out was a mobile device game, and but they're doing well. His group in there seems happily working along with what they're doing, and so you know I told him, I was like, yeah, maybe one of these days we'll all get to work on something together again. And he was like, yeah, next time you go to put one out, let me know if there's some way I can give you some support. So, that was great to hear from him. But yeah,
I'm just watching. I'm
things
just
change.
watching all these people with. I'm just watching all these people with massive, land tractors, BMW X3, X5, trying to park in these tight spots. I've got an X1. So, yeah, sorry, I butt in there. Keep going. Big red
Oh, no
lights here.
problem. Yeah. So, I went from Konami to working with Midway, which at the time was, one of a few larger American companies. I guess Activision had always set their sights early on to compete with EA. Um, but Midway had been around for a long time, as a arcade maker, and of course they started moving to try to get games onto the home play systems. So I joined them. I helped them with a Freaky Flyers is what the name of the game was. Project. It was a completely original IP game. Really fun team working on that. And they'd had internal struggles in the company trying to get things pushed through and get the game wrapped up. And they were making it for both PlayStation and Xbox. So I went in there and took over as producer on that and helped them wrap that up. And then I went on to work with the Gauntlet project. And this was the time where American companies started really looking hard at outsourcing a lot of their artwork, because at this point there were starting to be pools of talent in overseas locations to where the thought was, hey, we can get a large amount of this expensive work done for far cheaper. Um, and that led to a lot of interesting things, because at that time on Gauntlet, we checked around a lot of different places, and I ended up over in Ukraine before they had that first revolution over there to push out that Russian supported puppet government. And we worked with the group over there, and then when the little revolution started and everybody was getting worried then that the Russians were going to invade, the art director was like, well, I'm not going back over there anymore. And I just told the executive producer and all, I'm like, yeah, I'll go over there and keep up with how the production, because we were doing, we had about $1 million contract or something with them. We were doing animations, character modeling, texture mapping, all that with that group. And it was a lot of work and a lot of money for us at the time. And so they wanted somebody regularly, meeting with the group, making sure things were, staying in order, and, uh, overcoming any difficulties that we had in the on the phone, email, directions. So executive producer, he was worried. He's like, oh, maybe we should, end this whole thing. And I said, well, first off, I said, I don't think the Russians are going to invade anytime soon. But, if the art director's worried about going over there, I said, I'll go over there. It's no big deal. And they're like, well, what will you do if the Russians invade? And I said, I use my Marine Corps training. I'll steal a car in Kiev and drive over to the Hungarian or Polish borders and just go across. And I said, I know people in the other countries. I can get out. And then he sat there and looked at me for a second. You'd do that, wouldn't you? I said, yeah, it's no big deal.
Yeah, it was nowhere near as dangerous back then as it is now.
Oh, no,
Complete other.
nothing. Yeah, there was no shooting going on back then. So, and Kiev wasn't under, constant threat and constant actual missile attacks. So, yeah, it's a lot worse today. Luckily, many of my friends over there got out. And of course, some of the people I know, that decided to stay there and still functioning, they're putting up with a lot. So, yeah, best of luck to them, and hopefully everybody continues to support Ukraine, because what's happening, after the Holocaust, so many things were said never again. Yet right now, right there in Eastern Europe, again, it's happening. Russia's conducting genocide against a whole race of people. So
Yeah, it's just unbelievable. My father-in-law got back from I think the third or fourth time from Bakhmut there doing assistance in ministry and stuff. So it's always a relief when he gets back home.
yep, I understand. Yeah, it's a rough time there right now. So try not to slip too far into the military stuff again. I guess on the other side of that, from the time I worked with Midway, um, I'd met John Romero while I was there at Midway. He was working for the company for a while there, and then he left and started up a little startup back up in Silicon Valley area. And at the time, the kind of undercover, under the radar startup name for the group, they called it Slipgate Ironworks. So I ended up going up there and worked with them for a while. Their idea at the time was to launch a learning MMO, which there hadn't been anything like that at the time. Um, John was extremely fun to work with. I mean, we had a lot of fun times, working on design and playing other games while we were at it, and talking through the good, the bad of the games and how things had been designed, laid out. And we were constantly looking back and forth at, all right, how do we match up the playability open world feeling on an MMO with actually teaching something, to younger generations. And we worked with some professors out of Stanford University and all. We had some people came into the company from some other learning educational software groups. And that was a fun thing for a time. Problem for me was they first hired me in there directly as like, kind of the producer on the thing. And I was running a lot of tests with the design and art groups and making metrics out of it. And I started to realize I was like, at best, you guys are going to have about a 5-year production to try to get this MMO built out and include all the learning material that you're stating that you want to try to get into the game. And some of the people connected with the company were like, "Oh no, with everything from investors and so on, we've got to get a game out in a year and a half." And I was just like, "Well, you can get some small portion of a game out in that time, but not the complete thing that you're thinking of." And yeah, it got to be kind of an issue of contention. And you know, John looked at it realistically, and he kept arguing the facts about how things were going. But finally, I had some other friends that jumped into another project. And when I left Midway, I kind of had the idea that, hey, I want to start working with smaller, more independent companies outside of the big ones, just because of the uniqueness of how they sometimes take on different ideas and different projects. So that attempt at a learning MMO was the first round. And when I left there, I got mixed up with another group, which was titled Nival Interactive. Strangely enough, they were a company that supposedly American interest had bought out from Russians in Russia. And a group of us went over there, being from a Cold War era when I was in the Marines and everything growing up, and to being over there and actually walking around, Red Square and all. It was kind of surreal to me. But we went
Yeah,
in, we looked at what was going on at
it's surreal
Nival,
now
and we,
to a lot of people right now. Tell you what,
yep. And we went in, we were looking at what was going on there at Nival, and there was a lot of questionable, shaky things going on. And we found out, oh, and by the way, we have another studio out at Trinaburg. It's part of us that we bought just before the buyout. And we're like, what? So we traveled out there, and that was the area where long before, like, the American U-2 spy plane had been shot down. And until like right there around the time when the Soviet Union fell apart, right there at the start of 1990, 91, that area had been completely off limits to foreigners. So we flew out there and went into that area, and that was kind of an eye opener because coming in from the airport and going down the road, there's active SAM-2 missile sites all around the area. All these areas with signs going, warning, you enter here, you will be shot, and all this other stuff. And it was just like, wow, this is a trippy place. And of course, we meet the people at the studio, and they're telling us how they're going to do their work. And it's like, sorry, but you were bought by our parent studio, so now we're here to tell you about how you're going to do your work. So to make the long story short, yeah, we quickly found out that group was controlled by Russian interests that were here in the United States, and not what we had been originally told it was. We originally had been told, oh, there's $15 million behind the production for this thing, only to get into the studio and then be told, oh, well, we want you to go out and find your financing for this. So, yeah, that didn't last so long for us. And one day they suddenly shut down the part of the American operation because I guess they were trying again to make a deal with what was going on with the group in Moscow. So from there, I moved over to another startup group called Riot Games.
just got back from McDonald's. I'm breaking all the rules. I'm going to eat a burger while I'm doing the podcast.
Well, you eat your burger. I'm going to drink my new cup of coffee. But at Riot Games, I had a friend of mine introduced me to Brandon Beck and Mark Merrill back when they were just getting the idea, getting the company started. Um, there's a running joke between me and another guy as to who was, because they first hired a friend of mine to kind of set up and run their production process, to get the game started. And So another friend of mine and I, two of us were uh, hired on the same day there, as the second and third hired people into the company. It became Riot. Um, but we argue about which one of us was, second or third. And of course, the funny thing was that the day I was hired was the day I went in and interviewed, and I actually started working there at the company that day. So I told him, I said, "Well, you didn't come in until the next week, so I'm the second person in Riot Games out after the two founders." Yeah, which is strange now. And I look, I looked the other day, and I think Riot now has something like 4,090 employees. I think was the number that they had on LinkedIn. It's kind of hard to imagine, looking back. It's like, wow, we our initial studio too, because I went with them. We were searching for space, and a friend of mine and I found the first space for them, and it was an old drafting company, and it was set up with stalls and all, which had been the areas where the draftsmen used to sit and work on their boards. So that was the first space that we set up for Riot, and then the initial group, we brought in, we hired concept artists and 3D artists, and some of our first programmers, and a couple of guys to help with some of the design work, and it was interesting time, because we were pushing to get a prototype up and going, and then we took that up to E3 and pitched it, and then got, I guess they had some internal funding there from the start from family and friends, and then of course we got their first funding from investors during that E3 that really got their leg up to get going. Um, and then that they
So
hit a point where they were. I'm sorry.
how well known are you in the industry? It sounds like you know just about everybody in the industry now by this point.
Well, I don't know if I know everybody, but I've met a lot of interesting people along the way, and like I said, I've been fortunate, to work with a lot of interesting groups. Riot was just like many of the other groups I started with. They were small startup companies. Some of them never managed to get their funding, or managed to get the projects out the door that we'd started up with them. But it's been an interesting road. Riot was, one of the obvious success stories, becoming what it became. Uh, and a funny thing, from the time when I was there, I took Brandon over one of the places we went between China and India. I took him in to meet with the guys at Tencent. And of course, Tencent ended up being the group that bought them out, um, and helped set them up to be the international success that they became. Um, but along the way, there were other companies I'd worked with. Like after Riot, I'd worked with a group out of the East Coast, Majesco Studios. They've been around for a long time, uh, doing smaller games and interactive stuff. And of course, we turned out a few Game Boy Advance games for them, working out of a studio in Santa Monica, California. And as the time went by, I had another friend there in LA. This is where I really got introduced to like script writing, and we started writing and pitching scripts underneath. We had a little company we called Double Tap Entertainment. You know, Double Tap was the joke off of me being the ex-military guy. The two shots in the head as you go by, and him Double Tap being the guy that was always tapping on the keyboard. So he said, "Yeah, I'm always double tapping on stuff." So that became our script writing group's name. We did a lot of you know pitches and proposals on stuff there for that, but that never took off as a solid thing for us. And then there's just various groups along the ways, like Arctos Entertainment, and then I worked for Next Media out of Hong Kong and Taiwan. So the founder's name was Jimmy Lai. He'd made it really big in China with a clothing company, but he was very anti-communist. So needless to say, the Chinese government pretty much ran him out of the country. And he went to Hong Kong. He bought up a bottom of the basement newspaper and made that into Apple Daily, which became one of the number one newspapers there in Hong Kong. And and then of course he had seen kind of the writing on the wall for newspapers and all, and he was trying to move the company over into the digital area. And so I got in there when they were called in the group part of that Next Media. So and we were helping develop the whole setup for them to be doing games on the side and all. So I worked with them. They had one studio there in Hong Kong that was working on a couple game ideas. They had another group there in Taiwan that was doing some supporting work with that. And they'd invested in a number of studios up in Tokyo, one of which also they had a branch up in Hokkaido. So for I don't know, it was about almost like a year and a half's time frame or so. I was jumping back and forth across the Pacific, uh, jumping between Hong Kong, Taipei, Tokyo, and Sapporo. and after a while, that I just didn't know from day to day which time zone I was in, because if I was in the U.S., I was getting up at 2 a.m. to be on meeting calls in either Hong Kong, Taipei, Tokyo, or Sapporo. And when I was over there, I was sometimes up in the middle of the night to be on meetings with guys back here in the U.S. So, but that was an interesting thing along the way. I met a lot of nice people, had a lot of fun times and interesting places, and yeah, sadly they struggled along the way because of issues that were coming up between the parent company and the Chinese government. And of course, as you've as maybe some of the viewers might know, Jimmy Lai is currently in prison in Hong Kong right now. During the protest and all, he got swept up afterwards by the police under the new Chinese security law. They raided the company where I worked at. Some of the people I worked with there, they're all in prison now. And we understand that those of us that were on the payroll as foreign employees at the company, yeah, now all of our names are on the blacklist with the Chinese government. So as far as I'm concerned, traveling to, say, Hong Kong, Macau, mainland China, they're all off my travel itinerary now, because I'm concerned that the Chinese government may try to throw me in prison as being one of the people on that list that they now list as, foreign agents.
If China are supplying weapons to Russia right now, I think we're in the middle of World War III because
Uh,
or
I came to
or
the conclusion probably halfway between 2014 and when the war started in February last year. I came into the conclusion that we were already in the point where World War III, just like many other wars, was starting up, yet it wasn't recognized yet. And as time has developed, and once things kicked off last February, it was like very apparent that we're in an extremely bad place right now internationally. And it's mostly because of the governments that Putin and now Xi have basically taken over within Russia and China. They're the new dictators of our times. They're the new Hitler and Mussolini. And if people think that, well, this will all just go away if we just kind of look the other way, and as some people would like to say, well, we shouldn't get so involved in Ukraine. It's like, if we don't get involved in Ukraine now, wait until Poland's invaded and Finland's invaded, and just go down the list. The Russians aren't going to just stop with taking Ukraine. They may take some time, but just like when you look up, if you read Churchill's books about World War II, he talks about how Germany did the buildup, and little by little they nibbled away at things until finally, they went hog wild. And we're in the same point now. I mean, if Putin can survive what's going on at this time in Ukraine by crushing Ukraine and taking it, you're going to see more things start to fall. He's not going to be satisfied. And the fact that Xi so badly wants to find a way to take Taiwan, plus expand his control over other parts of Asia, it's a bad thing. I mean, when my son back there, when he was in the Marine Corps, he did a deployment to the northern part of Australia, where we have a new Marine Corps base that was started up a while back, to help the Australian government with so much of what's going on to help build up the Pacific region against, China's starting to spread out. They come in with the what is it, Silk Road program, oh, we'll give you all this investment and all we want is this little bit of, participation in your economy. And of course, then they start making demands on these companies these countries that they've now got deep into their pocket, with owing them. And yeah, little by little, they're grabbing bigger and bigger swaths of the South Pacific area. Of course, China gets a huge amount of their raw materials and fuel through that area, but so does South Korea, Japan, many other countries. And if China gets full control of it and then starts dictating to them what they can and can't have, it's just a bad scenario. But anyway, once again, off into world history and not into games.
Yeah, I just think that if China is sending weapons to Russia, then that really is a turning point because they have to be aware of the bad ill will that brings upon all the people that are trading with them. Like, I will probably fight tooth and nail to avoid buying stuff from China. From if that's the case, I think it is the case
Yeah,
because one of my friends on LinkedIn's posted about it. So, but I'll have to
yeah.
confirm it.
There's a lot of feelings on every side of the fence, or between different groups of people about Trump as president here in the United States. But he was absolutely right that we needed to bring our manufacturing more back home, or to make our manufacturing that's overseas deal with people in countries that are much more friendly to us, and that's
Yeah,
true of every free nation, whether in Europe or Africa or the United States. Anybody that's currently dealing with, say, China or Russia, it's just a bad place to be in, and they are not going to be good, fair trading partners. They are going to, you know, find a way to put the screws to you and to hold it over your head. So,
yeah. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes left. You've worked with a bunch of other companies in between now and then. So what's the most interesting thing about that, and what are you doing now, and how can you work with people with what you're
yeah,
offering?
like I said, of all the smaller startup type companies I dealt with, Riot Games was the hugest success overall. Um, but I've had a lot of interesting times, like between Next Media. Last few years, I've worked with a couple different ones. Did a little work for a French VR group in that's out of France, but doing work here in the U.S. as well. Um, but then, like I said, I'd worked with some former Sega friends with the company Amiya, which our whole plan then was to deal with talented companies and studios here in the U.S., connecting them with Japanese studios that had different interests and all. We were looking at keeping a lot of our work around VR, AR, even AI aided, projects. But the whole COVID thing kind of squished that to a degree, and that's now kind
Mm.
of hanging in limbo. So in the interim of all that, I've gotten back into script writing. I've got two friends, Japanese directors that I've been working with. Um, I really can't name current projects that they're working on, because of NDAs and such. Yet, uh, both of them they've had some interesting runs on things. I'm excited about the work that we're currently doing. Uh, you know, and I've also been working, like the last time I talked to you, Suzuki, we were talking about the projects that he was doing. I was telling him, like, I've got a game project that I'd like to maybe eventually even run up like as a Kickstarter and start it off, called The Night Princess, and it's kind of got a certain storyline. It has a certain, I guess I would say, Miyazaki feel to the background story. But that's one. I've got a children's book series that I've been working on for a while, actually for quite a while. But I've got one artist that she's done some work with me in the past through a couple studios. She did a take with me on the first storyline. A couple other people have expressed interest in working on it, and then I've now been fleshing out storylines for that, and it's all centered around this character called Dagnabbit Rabbit. So that one, I'm hoping within a short time to get like a first kind of children's book out of that, but then to start putting up as kind of like a digital entertainment thing for children, where the stories are now more interactive. You can go into a screen. I've been looking at a bunch of different software to where you could have a 2D image. It looks like it's a watercolor or marker drawing, of the characters and scenarios. Yet the children could then, on a tablet or something, go start poking into things, and just like some of the old LucasArts text, type adventure games and all, if you touch the right place, then something else opens out, and you can move deeper into the scene and move around. So I've been playing around with, what is it, Metal Canvas and Moho 2D animation software, but trying to look and blend some of this and then build it out, say using Unity as our foundation for an engine to drive this. So I've got several other friends that, we've been cooking on little wild ideas for a while, and little by little, it's like, okay, well, how would we approach this? And, I put the producer hat on. And I said, all right, how would we get this into development? How could we build it out? And then the creative director side of me goes, okay, the story could be this way, and we could set the design this way, and we could give it this kind of art style. So yeah, we've been kicking all of that around. We've got one, once again, it's centered kind of Japan. We're looking at taking a history section of Japan's history, kind of the warring states history, and saying, yeah, from about the time that Oda Nobunaga came to power and started fighting to try to bring, all of Japan together as one nation. We take that whole historical period of Japan, say from the 1500s into up to the early 1700s, yet we flip the history by, while we keep the same scenario, what goes on in the history, we add in Japanese mythological characters and yokai and obaki, so monsters, ghosts, and we make a fun, imaginative story out of it. So while the main characters are there, we've got all these Japanese cultural things that come to play within what we know is the true history, yet the true history, there's different reasons behind how it played out the way it did because of the interference of, old Japanese gods and monsters within the scenarios of what happened at the time. So, and to make that, whether you think of like, the teams that did like Samurai Jack or Primal, we're thinking of making it a kind of fun storytelling experience like that by using a period of Japanese history, yet using those cultural things to twist the makeup of the stories and what the characters are. I mean, we're even playing with the idea that, all the clans are not humans, but the clans are dogs and cats. So imagine a bunch of ancient samurai, but each clan is made up either of dogs or cats, and they're all struggling for control of Japan. Yet in the mix of this, you've got the old ancient Japanese ideas of different gods and monsters coming to play within the historical scenarios. So that's been one that, and we've been looking at. All right, so what will we need? How will we get this into production? So that's one that's ongoing as well. You can probably see I got a little board back here, all the little tags and all. So that's various books and game ideas and features that could be made either anime or even over to live action movies, depending on the subject or scenario. And if that isn't enough, my crazy writing style, I've had a couple of books in the writing right now. I put out a few with my partner there at Double Tap in the past. We put out two books in the past that we just released through Amazon. So one was called The Dog Licker, which was a romance comedy one about a guy that had extreme fear of dogs. And then the other one was called Demons of the Rising Sun, where we took a background scenario to events in World War II, and we wrote a semi-zombie monster story into the events of the war. And so now it's one of those things. It's like, okay, so that got my storytelling writing interest going. So I've got another World War II historic one that I've been working on called Shadow of the Whale, and that's set on the west coast of the United States and included ancient American Indian legend. And then there's a different one I've been working on bits and pieces, and it's basically the Harry Potter of Japan story. So anyway, that's where I am today with the stuff I've been doing. And now that I'm getting to a bit of an older age, I'm starting to find that I'm kicking back from doing the full time work to, all right, I'm just going to work on the things I really want to work on and make the best of it. My kids are all grown now; they've got their own careers, and now is the time for me to kind of focus more on just working on the things I find really entertaining myself.
That's how I'm feeling at 38, to be honest.
Yep, I totally understand.
Oh,
Back
it's like
when I
you
started,
lightweight.
I worked. Yeah, back when I started, and I was in the Activisions and Midways, and all the big name companies and all. It was great. It was a great ride, But after a while, you get to looking around, and you're like, I've worked really hard for a number of years, and I made a huge amount of money for other people. And yes, they paid me well along the way. But if I put this time and effort into my own ventures, I could do well. Plus, I could get, when you wake up in the morning, you've got that motivation to work on something. I have to say, some of the things I worked on for those companies, I would wake up excited in the morning to work on them. Spend the whole day, you work a 12, 14, 16-hour day and just be excited the whole time. And then other days you'd get up in the morning and it's like, oh, I got to deal with this again today, and, I'm at that point now where, yeah, when I wake up in the morning, I just want to be excited about the thing I'm going to work on today. So, all these things keep me excited, keep me going. So it's just like, yeah, I'm going to sit here at some point and I'm going to write my autobiography of my experiences, from a young man through the military and the game industry, and that'll be another fun little side book on the side. It's like, yeah, I liked Kurosawa as something like an autobiography about his whole experience growing up and getting into the movie industry, and I've read some of the stuff about Miyazaki's backgrounds and Disney's backgrounds, and it's like, yeah, all these guys had great lives, and in many ways, they had far more success than I have. But at the same time, I look back at my life so far, and I'm like, yeah, this has been a whole fun time. And I tease my sons all the time. I'm going to live to 130, so I'm 62 now, so 65 is my halfway point. So yeah, from here to however long the creator up above leaves me to be on this planet, yeah, I hope to spend that time on just putting my efforts behind things that are entertaining for other people and fun for me to work on.
That's interesting. You mentioned the creator above. It's the closer I get to 40, the closer I'll get to, it's like 70 or 80 the amount of years that the Bible promises. So I'm really aware of like how small this period of time is compared to the eternity, and I'm praying quite constantly, just let your will be done, God. I want to serve you. I want to be used for you, because
Yeah.
I don't want to look back short amount of time in eternity and think, oh, if only I'd made a bit more devotion to the season that.
Yeah.
So
Well, I had a, a defect in the aorta coming out of the heart, the major artery that feeds the lower part of your body. And they found it back when I was about 12 years old, and I had surgery on it when I was 13. And basically, they cut out a part of the artery right up next to the valve, and they spliced it back together. And I had a little bit of a problem. I was in the hospital last year about it. But when they did a look, and they ran a little camera up through my arteries up to my heart, they found that where that surgery was done all the way back then when I was 13, that area is still doing great, no problem at all. And that had been the one thing I'd been concerned about, that might at some point give out or cause me more trouble. So, and they also told me at the time, they said, "Oh, you've got the cleanest arteries we've seen in us, a guy your age in ages." So that was good news as well. So, I'm kind of like, very, very thankful to get all of that good news and say, well, maybe this is another sign that, hey, here's your time, make good use of it. And so I really want to put my efforts into that. I got some crazy eyes here back in February of last year when the stuff kicked off in Ukraine. It was like, oh, well, I'm going to have to go mercenary again and go over there and try to get my friends out of the combat zones. And thankfully, from the 2014 time till this incident last year, the main invasion started. Most of the people I knew in Ukraine closely, a lot of them got out, and the ones that are still there, they determined to be there to help the country survive. And of course, I have to be realistic. It's like, yeah, I'm getting older. I'm not sure how much help I would be to somebody. I mean, I still have talents and skill sets and all to use, to steal a line from Liam, what was it? Liam Nielsen. Anyway, but yeah, age slows you down as time goes by. So, yeah, I'm much happier to sit here behind my computer and work on fun characters and storylines and animations and such. And, hopefully
I
push
think
comes to
I
shove, I
think a
get
lot
to
of the
stay
I
here.
think a lot of the warfare doesn't really require you to be in that great physical condition. I mean, unless you're like trench warfare, you're jumping around from pit to pit to, you're
Well,
probably just operating
I
some kind
won't
of
say
mortars
where,
and
but
stuff.
there was a time when I ended up being somewhere, and I remember somebody else saying to me at the time, "You know something? We're too old for this." And I was like, "Yeah, yeah, you're probably right." And when you got to do about a 400-yard run to a helicopter, and you got it coming down on your back. Yeah, you start to think more about, nah, I'm not as agile and fast as I used to be.
I mean, it's funny thing is, well, not funny. It's like it's frustrating. You could train to be really fit, go to Ukraine prepared to do a lot of combat operations, but then you just get unlucky one mortar, and you're
Oh yeah.
no more advantage than someone who's not unfit. You're just blown up there and then.
Yep. No, it's and I found it to be very true of combat. And the funniest thing is I found it's true whether you're in film development or game development. You can go in with the best plans. Hey, this game is going to be the cutting edge of this and blah blah blah. And if the programming section can't handle getting together what actually allows you to build the game properly, you're screwed. If you could have the best script, the most talented actors, but something happens during the time for the production of the film and they can't edit it together well and blah blah blah, and the film comes out and it bombs. And no matter what your best laid plans on, whether hey, we're going to go into this fight and we've got all these advantages over our enemy, one little thing can go wrong. I guess what was it? Mike Tyson made the joke about, yeah, everybody has a plan until they first get hit in the face. And that's just true in life. It's it's not how much you succeed, but it's how many times can you stand back up from failing and try again or go on. And whether you look at that from just a plain human perseverance factor, or you look at that as a factor of I'm a creation of a God up there that cares, and I'm expected to try to do my best while I'm here. We all kind of have that. We all face things in life, and we all have to try hard to overcome the difficulties. And like I said, even if something fails the first time, get up and try again. All the companies I worked on, all the games I've worked with, yeah, there's been some that have failed. There've been games that just were no starters. There's been some we got out, and quite frankly, I would tell people, don't bother to play that. It just didn't turn out right. And it's disappointing when it goes that way, but at the same time, when you can do it and be successful at it, yeah, it makes all the efforts worthwhile. So, and I know as a game player myself, it's just like, yeah, some games I pick up, I don't play them very long. I put them down because it just didn't satisfy me. And then other games you pick up and you find yourself dreaming about playing the game because it was so fun and entertaining that even when you're sleeping, your mind is still, hey, this is a lot of fun to do. Let me just keep running scenarios on this.
Yeah. So what? Just for before we close this, what is it about games that you could use as teaching aids? That was quite interesting what you mentioned about that MMO.
Well, I found, strangely enough, back in the day, WoW had already been out and been going for a bit, but I picked up on it and started playing it. And funny, I was playing it with John Romero, and my sons at the time were just getting at the age where they were really starting to get into games, and so they started playing. And I found that in the case of WoW, like using the auction house, my sons kept going, "Oh, Dad, how did you get that mount? Oh, Dad, how did you get that armor? How did you get that new sword?" And I was like, "Oh, I did the mining, or I did the different things in the game, collect resources, sell them in the auction house, corner part of the market in the auction house to where I would buy up the things that were under a level I thought I could sell the items for, and then I would buy out the other people's stuff and just keep selling, and then get the items I wanted to." My sons are like, "Dad, are you buying gold?" I'm like, "Nope, not buying gold. I'm just earning it in the game." So I did a lot of training my sons how to handle money and finance playing WoW. And as we played through that, it became more and more apparent there's so many different ways, outside of even my personal experiences with, like, say with Lockheed Martin, when their guys came over, we did Desert Tank at Sega. There's so many ways you could set a game scenario up to actually teach people stuff. And a lot of different experiences that you can teach through games. Of course, the funny thing about that MMO we started with, there was a whole field that they were trying to aim that towards, and it was kind of an odd fit. Yet, as we planned out and did scenarios, it's like, this is doable. We could actually teach this subject in a game. Yet, it was one of those. Well, a lot of people, they come to games the same way you come to movies or a book. You read it more for entertainment value than you do for learning value. Yet, there are crossovers that you could make to do that, to make it to where somebody can be learning a subject while being entertained by it. So
Very hard thing to do, but worthwhile. Like, for example, Duolingo. That's a game where leveling up, learning languages. There was something called Flex Adventures, where you're basically learning HTML positioning by using this game for like a tower defense. But yeah, and also you could have learned for driving, military, combat operations. Those are the kind of games that I would be interested in playing. But I tend to avoid anything where I don't benefit from it after playing the game, like whatever benefit that is.
yeah, yeah. I mean, truth of the matter is, a lot of the games I play them for one of two things. Either I'm looking at the way the game is laid out and how you play it, or what entertainment value can I get out of this? Anyway, yeah, it's about time for me to wrap this up.
Okay,
So,
well, Jeff, you're a really interesting chap. I'll have to talk to you again, whether or not it's in person or on the internet, whatever it is. But thanks so much for your time, and thanks everybody for watching.
yep, thank you guys, and nice seeing you. Talk to y'all later.
See ya.
All right.